The Jets had 8 first-round busts in 11 years, with 4 different general managers and only 1 playoff appearance. From 2010 to 2021, the New York Jets didn't just fail to build a winner during the stretch, they burned through more draft capital than almost any other franchise in the league, and came out on the other side with almost nothing to show for it. We're going pick by pick to explain how this even happened in the first place. Mike Tannenbaum ran the Jets organization and the front office from 2006 to 2012. And truth be told, the early years weren't even that bad. It was towards the tail end. Rex Ryan's defenses were legit, and the team went back-to-back AFC Championship games, which made it look like the Jets were building something real for a minute. But his drafting in the first round during that window told a different story, and 2 picks in particular show exactly what was wrong with how he evaluated talent. Kyle Wilson was a 29th overall pick in 2010 out of Boise State. The case for Wilson was straightforward on the surface because he was a press corner with elite athleticism who led his program to an undefeated regular season. He looked like a shutdown guy in college, and he was, but that was at Boise State against Mountain West competition. That's a very different conversation than lining up against NFL receivers week in and week out for 16 games. The red flag was right there, but the Jets didn't either weigh it heavily enough or decided his physical tools would bridge the gap. But they didn't. Wilson spent his entire Jets career as a rotational piece rather than a cornerstone. He started 15 games total across his first 2 seasons combined, and when the Jets finally needed him to be a legit starter in 2012, he simply wasn't ready for the job. He left New York after 2014 and played 1 more year in New Orleans before his career ended with just 3 interceptions over 5 pro seasons. For context, Patrick Robinson went 3 picks later in that same draft and had a longer, more productive career. The Jets chose ceiling over reliability and got neither. After that rough start though, Tannenbaum would hit in the 2011 draft with Muhammad Wilkerson, which is what makes the next draft pick so weird. Quentin Coples was a 16th overall pick in 2012 out of UNC, and his story is the same thing as Wilson, just with a bigger frame. He was 6'6" and 284 pounds with the kind of athleticism scouts write poetry about. At North Carolina, he was disruptive and long, looking like the type of player who could wreck an offensive line by himself. The Jets needed another pass rusher, and Coples looked like the perfect fit. So they took him 16th overall and waited for the dominance to show up. It never did because the Jets couldn't figure out what to do with him. During his first season, he was a defensive end playing in a rotation and finished with 5.5 sacks, but then they moved him to linebacker for his second year. By his third season, he was back near the line of scrimmage, and since a player needs a defined role and consistent scheme to develop, Copel struggled to find his footing. He finished with 6.5 sacks in 2014, which was the high point of his career before the Jets cut him loose. Donta Hightower was still on the board when the Jets made that pick, and he went to New England within the next few picks to anchor their defense for a decade and win 3 Super Bowls. Tannenbaum's fingerprints on both picks are the same since he put physical traits first and scheme fit somewhere down the list. Wilson's athleticism masked the competition question, while Copel's frame masked the fact that he didn't have a clear position in the league. When neither player translated the way the Jets expected, there was no development infrastructure in place to course correct. Tannenbaum was fired after the 2012 season with the Jets sitting at 6-10. And the next guy walked in with a clean slate, but somehow made things even worse. John Idzik only had 2 years to run the show as the GM for the Jets, and during those 2 drafts, he was awful in both of them. It's actually an impressive level of consistency when you look at how different these 2 prospects were on paper. The 2013 draft is interesting because they had 2 picks. With one of the picks, they got Sheldon Richardson, who was a staple on the Jets for a long time, along with other teams in the league. But with the other pick, he drafted one of the biggest busts in NFL history. Milliner came out of Alabama in 2013 as a 9th overall pick, and at that time, his resume was almost impossible to argue with. He was a first-team All-American with 2 national championships under his belt, and he backed that up by running a 4.37 at the Combine while showing off the length and physicality Nick Saban loves. The Jets had just moved on from Darrell Revis, who's easily one of the greatest cornerbacks to ever play the game, so they desperately needed a blue-chip talent to fill that massive void. If you were building a draft board back then, you could make a very convincing case that Milliner was a perfect answer for a defense in transition. The fine print on his medical report was everywhere if you bothered to look though, including 5 different surgeries during his college career on his shoulder, hip, and knee. His body was already carrying a massive amount of mileage before he ever stepped foot onto an NFL field for a regular season snap, and he couldn't even do the bench press at the Combine because of a torn labrum. While some teams saw those as red flags and dropped them off their boards entirely, the Jets decided to ignore the warning signs and pull the trigger anyway. There was also real questions about whether his success from Alabama came from the system rather than his own traits, because he mostly played the short side of the field where the sideline acts like a second defender. Asking a guy like that to suddenly cover the entire field against NFL route runners is a completely different assignment that he just wasn't ready for. The results in New York were honestly pretty brutal to watch. Milliner gave up 6 touchdowns during his rookie season and got benched several times, which led to a massive loss of confidence that even his coaches noticed and even commented on publicly. By the time his second season rolled around, his ankle gave out, followed by his quad and then his Achilles. He only appeared in 21 games over 3 years before the team finally waived him, and his entire NFL career was over by the time he turned 24. The Jets drafted him to be the next Hall of Fame corner, at least Pro Bowler, but they ended up with a player whose body simply couldn't handle the physical demands of a professional schedule. Calvin Pryor was the 18th overall pick in 2014 out of Louisville, and while his failure was a bit quieter than Milliner's, it was just as damaging to the franchise because of the opportunity cost. He was a classic box safety who played with an aggressive physical style that was supposed to change the entire energy of the defense. His college game showed a guy who loved to hit and competed on every single snap, which is exactly what the Jets felt they were missing at the time. What they actually got was 3 years of being totally fine, which means he wasn't a total bust or constantly injured, but he also never became a true difference maker. When you spend a top 20 pick on a safety, being a warm body who makes a few tackles isn't nearly good enough to justify the investment. The team eventually traded him to Cleveland in 2017 to get Demario Davis back. Davis went on to become a 4-time Pro Bowler for the Saints after he left the Jets again, while Pryor only played 2 more games in the entire league before he was out of football for good. What really connects these 2 picks isn't that they just didn't work out, but rather the fact that the front office had no real plan for how to use them. Idzik took over a franchise that lacked a coherent defensive identity, and then he turned around and drafted 2 players who needed specific development and a strong system to succeed. There was nobody there to catch them. Mike Maccagnan took over the GM job in 2015 to stabilize an organization that had just gone through 2 other GMs in just a few years. But he didn't really do that either. His drafts were hit or miss because in 2015 he drafted Leonard Williams and in 2017 he hit on Jamal Adams. But outside of that, his other 2 seasons he kept the tradition of chasing high upside athletes alive. Darron Lee was the 20th overall pick in 2016 out of Ohio State, and he seemed to check every single box for what a modern linebacker should look like. Jets pitched him as a prototype for the next generation of linebackers, and if you only watched his highlights from Columbus, it was easy to believe the hype. The NFL reality was a much different story once he actually got onto the field though. Lee only weighed 232 pounds, and in the pro game, that means you're going to get washed out of the play by offensive linemen who are much bigger and stronger than anyone in the Big Ten. While coverage was supposed to be a big strength, opposing offenses actually targeted him on purpose because he couldn't stay with tight ends or fast running backs in open space. The Jets tried to hide these weaknesses by constantly rotating him in and out of the lineup, but that kind of inconsistency is usually the fastest way to kill a young player's confidence. His best year came in 2018 when he grabbed 3 interceptions during a solid midseason stretch. But just as things were looking up, a 4-year suspension for a substance violation effectively ended his time with the team. The organization released him after his rookie deal, and he eventually signed with the Kansas City Chiefs, where he served as a depth piece for a championship roster. He actually found a role there because they built a specific system that played to his strengths, which is something the Jets never bothered to do during his time in New York. While the Darron Lee pick definitely hurts the franchise, it really is just a footnote compared to the disaster that unfolded with Sam Darnold. Now I get Sam has definitely redeemed himself, but for the Jets, we can't act as if his tenure there wasn't a bust. Darnold was a 3rd overall pick in 2018 out of UFC, and he was easily the most important selection of this entire era because of what his career proved about the Jets' culture. His college resume was a real deal, as he threw for over 7,000 yards in his final 2 seasons while showing off elite arm talent and the kind of pocket awareness scouts love. The Jets were so convinced that he was a franchise savior that they drafted him over Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson. But what the organization actually handed him was a total demolition zone that no young QB could be expected to survive. Todd Bowles was the coach during his rookie year, but he was quickly replaced by Adam Gase, who wanted to run a complex Peyton Manning-style offense that required elite processing speed. That system only works if you have a 10-year vet under center, yet the Jets expected a 21-year-old kid to run it while throwing to receivers who never reached 900 yards in a season. During that first year under Gase, the team used 3 receiver sets on 72% of their snaps, which left a struggling young QB completely exposed behind a terrible offensive line. This wasn't a development plan for a top prospect, it was sink or swim experiment where the team forgot to hire a lifeguard. He finished his time in New York with a 13-25 record, throwing 45 touchdowns against 9 interceptions before the team finally gave up on him. When the Jets traded him to Carolina for a handful of mid-round picks, he went to another organization that misunderstood how to build a functional environment around a QB. Eventually, he went to the 49ers where he learned a lot and then went to Minnesota, which gave him legitimate weapons and a sensible scheme, which allowed him to throw for over 4,000 yards and 35 touchdowns. Parlaying that, he earned a new contract with the Seahawks and won a Super Bowl ring with Seattle in his first season. The truth is, the Jets didn't actually draft a bust when they took Sam Darnold 3rd overall. They drafted a legitimate starting NFL QB, but spent 3 years making it impossible for him to succeed, and then traded him away for pennies on the dollar. Joe Douglas walked into the GM role in 2019, and he had more draft capital than any of his predecessors had at the time when he first started making selections, and yet they still never made the playoffs. The front office finally looked like it had learned its lesson from a decade of disaster, and Douglas himself was a scout who had built a massive reputation evaluating talent in Philly and Chicago. Everyone thought the Jets were finally in good hands, and in 2019, he started out with a bang drafting Quinnen Williams, who would become one of the best D linemen in the league rather quickly. But his next 2 first-round picks made this era look exactly like the mess that came before it. Mekhi Becton was a prize in 2020, coming out of Louisville as the 11th overall pick. He stood at 6'7" and weighed 364 pounds, yet somehow clocked a 5'10" 40-yard dash at that massive size. He possessed the incredible length to lock down elite edge rushers and the raw power to pancake any defender who tried to beat him inside. Scouts labeled him a generational talent prospect, and for once, that wasn't just draft season hype. During his rookie year, he played 14 games and looked like a future All-Pro. Jets fans finally had a real cornerstone on the offensive line, and the expectation was that he would anchor the left side for the next 10 years. Everything changed in week 1 of 2021, though, when he dislocated his kneecap and missed the rest of the season. He tried to come back in 2022, but he suffered another knee injury during training camp that cost him the 2nd straight year. By the time he finally returned in 2023, the Jets had moved him to right tackle, which is a quiet way for an organization to admit they no longer view a player as their long-term answer on the left side. He actually managed to start most of that season, but this team still declined his 5th-year option and let him walk in free agency. Becton eventually signed with Philadelphia, where the Eagles moved him to right guard, and he started 15 games on his way to winning a Super Bowl. Becton's story is mostly about bad luck, which makes him a bit different from the other names on this list. However, the way the Jets handled his return, the constant position switching, and the lack of a real plan to help him succeed added a layer of organizational failure on top of those injuries. Then we have Zach Wilson, who went 2nd overall in 2021 out of BYU. And this failure falls on every single person involved in the scouting process. The Mormon Mahomes nickname took off after his pro day went viral, featuring arm angles that looked impossible and deep balls thrown from every platform imaginable. He showed off a level of mobility that made you forget about the weak competition he faced in college, and that is exactly where the problem started. BYU wasn't playing Power 5 schools, so the defenses Wilson was carving up every Saturday weren't close to what an NFL coordinator puts on the field. Once he got to New York, Zach simply couldn't process what he was seeing fast enough to survive. He held onto the ball way too long, missing easy throws underneath, and never showed the kind of pre-snap recognition that separates starters from busts, finishing with 9 touchdowns and 11 interceptions while going 3-10 as a starter. By year 2, the Jets had built a much better roster with stars like Sauce Gardner and Garrett Wilson, but Zach still couldn't hold on to the starting job. The moment that truly ended his time in New York happened after a brutal 10-3 loss to New England in 2012. When a reporter asked if he felt like he let his defense down, he said no. And that answer destroyed whatever respect he had left in the locker room. He was benched shortly after, traded to Denver after another disappointing season, and the experiment was over. The Jets tried to fix the hole by trading for Aaron Rodgers, but he tore his Achilles just 4 plays into his first game. Wilson was a bust and Rodgers got hurt immediately, which meant the team traded one QB nightmare for another. Looking back at the history of this franchise, that kind of luck feels almost perfectly on brand. The constant turnover at GM is a real reason why this cycle never stopped. Mike Tannenbaum built a specific philosophy, but he got fired and replaced by John Idzik, who had a completely different set of priorities. Idzik only lasted 2 years before Mike arrived to change everything in the plan again, followed eventually by Joe Douglas. Every one of those transitions brought in new scouts and new grading systems, which meant the team never had a consistent identity. You can't build a winning culture when you change your scouting criteria every 3 years. By the time a new GM actually gets his system in place, the owners are usually already deciding whether to fire him or not. This meant every draft class was treated like a standalone project with no institution of memory of why the previous regime failed. The coaching changes made the situation even worse because young players need a stable system to thrive. Milliner was drafted to be a press physical corner for Rex Ryan, but the next staff wanted him to play zone. Darron was drafted as a fast coverage linebacker, but then he was asked to take on 300-pound guards because the new coaches had a different defensive scheme. Sam Darnold was handed an offensive coordinator who built a playbook for a 15-year veteran, which is the last thing a 21-year-old kid needs when he's trying to learn how to read a defense. We always blame the players for not developing, but the development doesn't happen by accident. It requires a coaching staff that knows how to teach, a scheme that highlights what a player does well, and enough time for those players to get comfortable. The Jets gave their first round picks almost none of those things. Mekhi Becton came back from a brutal injury to find out that his team had already given up on him as left tackle. Zach Wilson was bad, but he was also forced into an offense that put all his weaknesses on display instead of hiding them while he adjusted to the speed of the NFL. The Jets weren't selecting in a vacuum where no talent was available to them. They were selecting in drafts full of players who worked out elsewhere, sometimes at the same position and often picked within just a few slots. From 2011 to 2021, the Jets made the playoffs 0 times, and that's a depressing backdrop against which every one of these picks played out. There was no winning culture to accelerate development and no established veteran presence to show young players how to compete at a high level week after week. Instead, you had rotating coaches with changing schemes and had first-round picks arriving into an environment that had no idea what to do with them once the draft night applause stopped. Now, over the past few years, their first-round picks have been much better. Still no playoff success though, but that's at least not due to lack of first-round talent. Hopefully, they make a push soon. So there you have it. Watch this next video if you haven't already, and subscribe if you're new. Thanks for watching.